All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos. And tonight we have a very fun and interesting stream. This is sponsored by our brother, Jay Zuna. Shout out to Jay Zuna for sponsoring tonight's stream, of which he wanted to talk about mass migration. His focus initially was a little bit more contemporary, as you can imagine. And so I said, how about we change it to something more historical? And maybe we can draw parallels from analyzing a historical event. And so I offered up the mass migration period towards the end of the Western Roman Empire. And so our conversation today is talking about this incredibly influential period in history. Again, where you mark it and end it is a scholastic debate, just like where exactly you end the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Most people would speculate 476. That's the general consensus, where we have basically the first labeling of the king of Italy as a Germanic king. That would obviously be the Ostrogoths. So what we're talking about today is a period that spans hundreds of years. We're going to be mostly focusing on the sort of post-Diocletian Rome. So when he breaks Rome into various separate, essentially smaller kingdoms. And we'll look at the rise of Christianity, because St. Constantine the Great and the changing of the Roman Empire to Christianity is actually going to play an interesting part in today's story. I didn't initially think it was going to, because I'll say right off the bat, I am no Roman scholar. So there's going to be plenty of things that I may miss or not give due attention towards. But we're going to be covering a large swath of history that basically demonstrates why Europe looks the way it does now. Why is France called France, and who were the Franks? Why, where and why is Germany Germany? Who were the Burgundians, right? Burgundy. Who were the Vandals? These are all Germanic tribes that are going to be incredibly influential in our story today. And so First, I want to lay out like what exactly are some of the takeaways from mass migration, because we're going to be all over the place in regards to the historic timeline. I've created a timeline over what I would consider some of the most important events from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. Obviously, our conversation today is going to be focusing really on that point in which the Western Roman Empire falls, and all focus is laden towards the Eastern Roman Empire. We're going to be looking at Emperor Theodosius the First, also a saint in the Orthodox Church, monumental in the preservation of our Orthodox faith. And again, his attack on the Goths using the Goths, and Alaric the First, eventually he's going to go back and he's going to sack Rome at the beginning of the 5th century. And so this is something that is interesting, because when you look at the relationship between these Germanic tribes and the relationship to Rome, it's one that goes both ways. So I have a list, and I'll get to it here in just a second, that it's interesting how many of these Germanic tribes adopted many Roman practices. So aspects of their dress, jewelry for sure, um, uh, legal styles. Many of the more educated German kings and generals could read, and they were fluent in Latin. But also, there's many ways in which they rejected Roman identity, and that's really the central point when we look at why mass migration negatively influenced Rome. Is a question comes, were the Germanic tribes ever Roman? And we'll be looking at how the Roman Empire adopted large swaths of Gothic warriors to fight for them, and that's throughout the history, right? This is well before our history today that we're going to be focusing on in regard to the mass migration period. But if you're familiar with Caesar's wars and him conquering Gaul and moving into Hispania and conquering Carthage in northern Africa, that it was throughout Roman history they were using various mercenaries and hiring soldiers. And even towards the end, where our story is really going to focus, we can look at somebody like Etesius, who is using the Huns for his campaigns, and eventually that's going to backfire when their war against Attila, although they win in the Catalonian plains. And that's really kind of the last victorious battle of Rome. And what prompted all these Germanic tribes to move in what we would consider more contemporary Ukraine, Russia, Eastern Europe into Western Europe. And it had to do with the Huns and the invasion of the Huns and forcing mass migration. And so, how exactly are those large takeaways? Well, we can look at one is that the weakened moral and social decay of Rome, the overstretched military, and the sort of decrepit economic state that the Roman Empire found itself in all aided to the fact that it was no longer able to fully assimilate many of these people. We'll be discussing the fact that the Roman Empire began allowing conceding land to Gaul so that they would be a buffer both to the Huns and to various other nomadic tribes that may want to initiate some type of warfare. So this conceding of land, this allowing the various barbarians to rise in their military, and there's many great examples. So I'm not saying that that's a negative, because it's quite clear that the German tribes were great at warfare, had a different style than the Huns, that's for sure. But the point is identity, right? Because as we'll see, many of the same allies of the Roman Empire, the same ones that will sort of eventually dominate, and the Ostrogoths will eventually take over the Italian peninsula. We'll see Burgundy. We'll see the Visigoths take over their section of Spain and southern France. We'll see the Franks move into modern day France. We'll see the Anglo-Saxons after this period begin massive invasions into Britain, and they're going to eventually establish their Anglo-Saxon states. I actually just watched a documentary on Alfred the Great, and the Anglo-Saxons eventually defeating the Vikings, and Wessex essentially taking over and forming the first English kingdom. But today's stream, again, it's a large span of history. I am no expert. I'm going to do my best to present the mass migration period, why it's important, how it participated in the fall of the Western Roman Empire, particularly Rome, and where the role of Christianity played into this, and how we can think about mass migration in the contemporary period. Again, the first one is identity. Identity. So kingdoms throughout history had migrants. That's no surprise. It had to do with how they assimilate. How are they able to sort of maintain their identity, but then adopt the identity of the larger empire? And Rome eventually was unable to do that for many reasons. And so differences in language, customs, and religion are a major, major focus when we're looking at mass migration and whether a group of people are going to be able to assimilate or not. I have, again, here I have a list of um, various features that related to what was adopted and what was rejected. And I've gathered this through basically a week long of watching documentaries and trying to really grasp the full historical understanding of the Roman Republic to the empire to the fall and movement into the Eastern Roman, which ironically being Orthodox, I know a little bit more about. But some of the adoptions that the Germanic tribes eventually took over through centuries of interactions with the Romans was like the administrative system. So many Germanic leaders adopted Roman administrative practices to govern their newly acquired territories more effectively. They recognized the sophistication of the Roman governance, law, taxation systems, which helped maintain order and facilitate the integration of the Roman and Germanic populations. Another one was military tactics. No surprise, Rome dominated due to their military tactics, and the Germanic tribes ended up incorporating Roman military tactics, organization, and even equipment into their own forces. The Roman legions' discipline and strategies were admired and emulated by Germanic chieftains who sought to strengthen their armies. Architecture and infrastructure. Everybody knows the the long legacy that Rome has had in building infrastructure all throughout Western Europe. And so the Germanic peoples also adopted Roman architectural styles, engineering techniques, and infrastructure, including the construction of roads, bridges, and fortifications. This adoption facilitated more trade, more movement, and better communication across former Roman territories. And the last thing that is also going to play, if you're familiar with the Civil War, that Emperor Theodosius, a great figure in the Orthodox Church and the preservation of our faith, he eventually waged a war with the Western half. This was a civil war in Rome after he defeated the Goths. And that was because of the resistance to Christianity. That Christianity is actually an interesting crux here because we can see the Goths that are much more loyal to Rome, especially after this period, after the 370s, let's say, was because they ended up converting to Christianity. And those that maintained their pagan practices also then allied with the Western half of the Civil War, which wanted to revive the pagan Roman practices that eventually Theodosius I stamped out. And this was the full conquering of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, which, again, fast forward 100 years, is collapsed in the West and is fully alive in the East in Constantinople. Now, what were some of the things that the Germans did not adopt and kept unique, and I would say argued to their antagonism towards the Romans? Well, it was the loyalty to their people, first and foremost. And that's where I bring in the idea of being Roman. When you look at the history of the Roman Empire, many people were adopted in from different traditions, different groups of people. But there was this prestige of being Roman and what that meant. And people wanted to become Roman in customs, in culture, in language. But for the Germans, they were very focused on their tribal people and maintaining their tribal identity. So loyalty to tribal leaders, the Germanic societies were organized around loyalty to tribal leaders first and foremost. And even when the Romans would utilize Goths or these former, whatever mercenary group, they would still be led by their own tribal generals. And sometimes this backfired. Sometimes the Goths would actually aid with the enemy, and that they would then backstab the Romans. There's multiple examples of that. And Alaric the First, who eventually sacks Rome in the beginning of the 400s, the beginning of the 5th century, he was mad because Theodosius was already worried about having to concede land to the Goths, who came into what would be considered modern-day Romania, Bulgaria, basically Thrace. And he put them on the front line when they went to go fight the other Goths. And Alaric was pretty pissed about it because he felt like it was an attempt to basically sacrifice his men, which to a degree it was. And this stirred his ire, and why then he eventually, though he was an ally with Theodosius, after Theodosius' death, ends up sacking Rome eventually. So, so loyalty to their tribal leaders and their tribal people never stopped in regard to the mass migration. And this is something that we can think about in the contemporary period, right? Interesting too, in regard to the contemporary period, I talked about how many of these Germans wanted to adopt aspects of Roman society, and in many ways they looked up to it. And so you think about mass migration in the world right now. You can think of South America, Central America into the United States. You can think of the Islamic world into Europe. And in both those scenarios, we see that the people migrating both don't see themselves as the places in which they're migrating to, but in the same way also valorize many dimensions of the people that they're moving towards. And everybody's familiar with how important soccer and European culture and style is for many Middle Eastern Muslims and the Islamic community. And so it's interesting that there's always an affinity, but there's also then this maintaining of a separate identity. And so, continuing on our list here, also Germanic laws and customs. So, while Roman law influenced the legal systems of the Germanic kingdoms, these groups retained their own legal traditions and customs. The application of law often depended on tribal affiliations and traditions, with practices such as trial by ordeal and congregation remaining common. So, this is interesting too when we think about specifically in places like England, where, and I'm not English, I don't have boots on the ground there, not familiar, but from videos I've seen, there's a significant swath of Islamic um, settlers, Muslim Englishmen, I guess, although they're not really English. I would say just Muslim migrants, let's put it that way. And they're openly in the streets of London asking for Sharia law. And ironically, there seems to be very few resistance by many of the native English people. And I only highlight that because language, religion, customs, and law are major separations for cultural assimilations of peoples. There's many examples of people being assimilated into a culture nicely. Now, again, when we look at Europe, one of the things that happens after this mass migration is many of these Germanic tribes end up converting to Christianity. But a Latinized form of Christianity, which is, again, that linguistic separation we can even see cause difficulties in the Christian kingdom as well, between the Eastern and the Western forms of it. So just keep all this stuff in mind as we move through. I know there's going to be a lot today. The other thing that I mentioned that they retain is language. So even though many of the more erudite and learned German general or Germanic generals, tribal leads, kingsmen, they would learn Latin, but they would always, as a group of people, maintain their language group. And the Germanic tribes maintained their own language throughout, which evolved into Germanic languages of medieval and modern Europe. Latin remained the language of administration, liturgy, and scholarship, but was not the mother tongue of the Germanic peoples. And that's why French and German still exist today, even though the church was in Latin, right? And so military leadership was a basis for kingship. This is another thing that's really interesting, because one of the things that made Rome great through its history was its ability for meritocracy, that the best would rise to the top. Unfortunately, as it got into its later days, this focus on not so much the best person, but that who has the familial relations, that who's next in line, and there's a lot of backstabbing, right? So the Game of Thrones is very accurate, not just for Rome, but also Eastern Roman Empire. So I know we're all Orthodox here, and we have a special place in our heart for Byzantium. But if you've ever studied that history as well, a lot of backstabbing, a lot of murders. And that is also true in the context of the Western Roman Empire as it fell. But Germanic societies often elevated, so their civic administration was not hereditary aristocracy as it was in Rome at this point, but Germanic societies often elevated military leaders to positions of power. So competent military men of power. Kingship was frequently based on the ability to lead and protect the tribe in warfare. reflecting a different set of values and social organization. Now, this focus on meritocratic abilities in warfare as the leaders of the tribe, I think, obviously benefited the Germanic tribes. And it's true even when you look at things like the American Revolution or the founding of America. I've highlighted before watching documentaries on Andrew Jackson, and a man that was able to, I think he was in 4 different duels, led the Americans at the Battle of New Orleans, a great accomplishment against then the greatest military in the world. But he was able to lead in war, lead men, and in a more traditionally based society based on real reality, was then elevated to be a political leader. And so this relationship to the ability to warfare and to lead men and to lead a nation, obviously we've totally been detached from that. Tell me a political leader who's actually led men in battle and has, fought on the front lines, is a great general and has a wonderful military strategy. We're not led by those people. We're led by narcissist people that are only out for themselves. And in a way, we're kind of mirroring the end of the Roman Empire in that degree. And so if mass migrants focus not so much on aristocracy or hereditary elements for power, but focus on meritocracy, they're going to have a leg up on whatever empire they occupy themselves in, because those are actually falling apart. So interesting point to be made there. Now, when we look at an overview of the migration period, it's often also referred to as the wandering of the peoples, and was a pivotal era in the history of Europe, spanning around the year 300 to 800 AD. However, our conversation's really focusing between the years of 300 to 500. I didn't really prepare much material for after that, although I do have a really excellent video for us to check, because we're going to be talking about the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons. And for some people, this is really just an introduction to this topic. This is not me giving a dissertation on this topic. This is more an introduction so that you can kind of figure out what it is. And if you want to do more research, you can. But this epoch was characterized by widespread migrations and invasions by various Germanic tribes and other nomadic groups across the Roman Empire, leading to a profound transformation in the political, social, and cultural landscapes of the continent. These movements were not only a cause, but also a consequence of the weakening of the Roman Empire, eventually contributing to its collapse in the West by the late 5th century. And that's important to realize. This collapsing of Rome, or the Western Roman Empire, this is due not only to the external factors, which were significant, but if they were internally cohesive in the Roman identity and the social morale and moral customs and civic life weren't also degrading, then they wouldn't have been so susceptible to these exterior forces. And so the only way that Rome actually collapsed, the Western half, is due to its own degradation on the internal factors. And then the external factors combined, this leads to, and so you think about Europe, you think about America, and you think, that's really interesting that to take down a great power, you can't just use an external force, especially if they have a unified identity. But if they're constantly competing and fracturing within it, and the moral and civic life has degraded, well, they're much more susceptible to an external force, especially if that force isn't susceptible to the same internal forces that it's getting ready to conquer. And so causes of the migration period, there's multiple. The migration period was triggered by a complex interplay of factors. Climate change was one of them, that there was actually a cooling of the Earth's temperature, making it forcing tribes to move to new locations to find hospitable land to grow food. So at this point, we're looking at between the years 300 AD to 500 to 800 AD, the Earth was cooling and land was less fertile, and this pressured tribes to migrate in search of better living conditions. Additionally, and most specifically, so this was the natural reason why Germanic tribes were moving, but the real reason or the most important reason to keep in mind, is the Huns. The Huns. And we're going to get into, we're going to pull up and we'll learn a little bit more about the Huns here in a few. But they were a nomadic peoples, an incredible warrior group on horseback, archers, with ability to throw spears, and incredible horseback warriors, nomads. And they basically left from Central Asia into Europe in the late 4th century, so the late 300s. And this is what forced the Goths fleeing, because they were getting annihilated battle after battle, these Gothic kingdoms that were outside the Roman Empire, kind of like a buffer state. They were getting destroyed and they were fleeing their lands into the safe harbor of Rome. Now, Rome, they're getting all these migrants in, and they're historically antagonistic to them, and yet they're seeking shelter. And in some cases, when they didn't get what they wanted, they would just start pillaging the countryside within various Roman territories. So that's where then Rome had to make some appeasements. And I have a section here where we're going to learn about Saint Constantine and Saint Emperor Constantine and Saint Emperor Theodosius, and some of the agreements that they made to try to placate the Goths. Because really, by the time of Constantine, and the early 300s, by the time that Rome is converting to Christianity, this is already a problem. And not everybody was on board with Christianity. This is quite clear in the Civil War that Theodosius stamps out, because the pagan celebrations, pagan rituals, all this stuff was revived in the Italian peninsula. And Theodosius was an ardent Orthodox Christian, and he was not playing games when it came to heresies like Arianism, and he was not playing games in regards to this revival of Roman paganism, and he stamped it out. So the impact on the Roman Empire regarding this mass migration period, the Roman Empire was already experiencing internal challenges, as I said. By the times these migrations intensified, political instability, economic difficulties, military was absolutely overstretched. The social decay, they didn't have enough soldiers. This is why they had to enlist so many Gothic mercenaries and soldiers, which eventually, they can decide to turn on you. And I have an article to highlight that even in the United States, I know Senator Durbin, Democrat, he is pushing legislation to offer all the illegals that are coming in the country right now to serve in our military. And also, a part of Roman history is interesting that when they wanted to control a population, they would tend to have soldiers that were not part of those peoples. So if Rome needed to placate a rebellion somewhere, they would make sure to send soldiers that were not related to those groups of people, so that they had no affinity or tie ethnically to those people, and would be much harsher in their condemnation and their corralling of whatever uprising occurred. And so you can imagine, that's quite interesting. I wonder if Europe and America would start having mass migrants join the military and service to control domestic populations. That seems like that'd be consistent with history. But anyways, I digress. The point is not today, but obviously I want to lay all this stuff out so you guys can get your own perspectives and takeaways and see how this relate to the contemporary period. The impact on the Roman Empire, as I said, social decay, moral decay, the weakened empire's ability to repel invasions, and they were forced to bring in more people. But at the same time, because of the sort of ethos, the Roman ethos was so degraded, they were not able to assimilate these people into their kingdom as they were able to historically. And the migrations exacerbated these problems as the Roman military struggled to defend its extensive borders against the continuous waves of newcomers. And so, as I said, the major migrant groups we're going to be focusing on, although I'll be describing more, is the Goths. That's divided into Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, who are among the first to move. And they were pressured by the Huns to do so. The Visigoths famously sacked Rome in 410 under King Alaric I. This was the Gothic gentleman who was upset with Theodosius, Emperor Theodosius, because he put his men on the front line fighting other Goths, of which was a vicious hand-to-hand combat, and sacrificed many of Alaric's men. So even though the Rome won that battle and Theodosius defeated the Goths, Alaric was a little upset about it and eventually came and sacked Rome. And of course, the Ostrogoths are the ones who eventually take over the Italian peninsula. And so this was led by eventually Theodoric the Great, later established the Kingdom of Italy. And so then we have the Vandals. How many people are familiar with the Vandals and the fact that a Germanic tribe took over Carthage in northern Africa for a significant period of time? So the Vandals crossed the Rhine, that's Germany, and the Rhine and the Danube are going to be central geographical points to keep in mind in regards to what exactly the Roman Empire is in relationship to modern day Europe. Everything west of the Rhine was Gaul, which was under Roman control. Everything south of the Danube was under Roman control. And so as they began to cross the Rhine and south of the Danube, they're entering Roman territories. The Vandals crossed the Rhine in 406 AD, eventually conquered parts of Roman North Africa. They move into Spain, Hispania at that point, and the Helsinki, which is a part of the Vandals, all these tribes that were really around the Black Sea area. So they moved all the way from the Black Sea, which would be Eastern Europe, moved through Eastern Europe, through Germany, modern day Germany, across the Rhine, into Gaul, still contentious, eventually get there down into Hispania, found a little bit more a place to settle for their people. And eventually they cross Spain into northern Africa. And this is the Vandal takeover of Carthage and eventually create the Vandal kingdom. And so they conquered parts of northern Africa and sacked Rome in 455 AD. 455. So just within 50 years, Gaiseric, who is the king of the Vandals, is able to establish a kingdom in northern Africa, which is huge because that's where the grain production is for the Roman Empire. So if you control Carthage, you control northern Africa, you control a lot of the food that is going into the Roman Empire itself. And so then we have the Huns. Obviously, many people are going to be familiar with Attila, the Hun, one of the great warriors and enemies of Rome. He was a significant force that terrorized both the Eastern and Western empires, although they did not establish a lasting empire in Roman territories. And of course, after Attila died, the Huns and their occupation of everything north of the Danube and east of the Rhine pretty much dissipated. And that's why we really don't have a whole lot of cultural evidence and historical understanding of who the Huns were. But we'll get into that here in a few. And then you have the Franks, another Germanic tribe, settled in Roman Gaul and eventually founded what would become the Frankish Empire under Clovis I, laying the groundwork for modern day France and Germany. And of course, anybody familiar with Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire, he was a Frankish king who basically brought stability to that entire region in relationship to Pope Leo III and making an agreement that he's basically the king or the Western Roman emperor, and the Pope is the religious leader, trying to mirror what the symphony between the church and state existed in the East. And then the Anglo-Saxons, a group of Germanic tribes, migrated to the British Isles, leading to the gradual emergence of England as well. So all these are major factors in our conversation of mass migration today. And the traditional date, as I said, for the fall of Rome is 476, although that's kind of a debated topic. So I'm just going to go with the general consensus there. That's when the Ostrogoths essentially claim that they are the new rulers of the Italian peninsula. It was when the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, and this event was more of a symbolic end than a sudden collapse. And much of the Western Empire had already been under control of various Germanic tribes for decades. And so that's interesting too, is that the fall of Rome was not some decisive battle where all Rome stood to fight for its life. It was sort of a defeated foe already and basically rolled over because it was they were already there. And so it was basically a smooth transition. And that's where, again, maybe people in the modern period, in the contemporary period, need to be worried about the fact that you settle people that have different language, different customs, different religion, and even particularly different legal rules within their in group, and how them being there for over centuries allows for eventual smooth transition itself. So I wanted to lay that out in regards to looking at the fourth, the 5th and the 6th century. I have a video that I want to show, but it's difficult for a lot of people to keep a historic timeline. So bear with me here. We're going to move through a bit of a historic timeline so that you can understand what periods we're looking at. And when we watch our video, it'll help you better understand what exactly you're hearing. So we're focusing on beginning really around 376 AD. Now, remember, the official fall of Rome is 476, so that's only a 100-year period. And so in 376, the Goths fleeing the Huns are allowed to cross the Danube. Now, this is the Eastern Roman Empire, and this was under Theodosius, and settled into the Roman territory. This event marks a significant early interaction between Roman and barbarian peoples that would set the stage for future conflicts. Now, eventually, those Goths are going to ally with the Romans to defeat other Goths, other groups, but they're also going to eventually turn on them, as Alaric I does. And so in 378, 2 years later, that's the great battle of Adrianople, and sees the Goths defeat the Roman emperor, killing Valens. This battle is often cited as a critical event in the decline of the Roman Empire, demonstrating the growing power of Germanic tribes. In the 5th century, so we're talking about the 400s, and 406, a coalition of Germanic tribes, including the Vandals, the Alans, that's another group that we'll look up, and the Suebi, crossed the Rhine into Roman Gaul. This mass movement is a key moment in the migration period, leading to the eventual establishment of kingdoms within the Roman Empire. And so in 410, then we have the sack by Alaric I of Rome. So this is a Visigoth king. And so King Alaric sacks Rome in 410 AD. Though largely symbolic, this event shocked the Roman world and signaled the beginning of the end of the Western Roman Empire. In 429, we have the Vandals led by King Gesseric going across into northern Africa by 439 to capture Carthage, establishing a powerful kingdom that would dominate the Western Mediterranean and pose a significant threat to Rome. In 451, we have the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Now, this is really the last great victory of the Roman Empire against the Huns. This is when Attila and the Huns are actually defeated, and they're helped by the Visigoths and the Franks. Although there's also Goths and Franks and Anglo-Saxon fighting for the Huns, there's also Goths, Franks, and Anglo-Saxons fighting for the Romans. And so again, the question is identity. Why is it that the same groups of people, although different tribes within a larger tribal group, would side with opposing groups? What's best for them? What's best for their people? And so in a way, they hedge their bets. They're on both sides of the war. But this had to do also with the adoption of Roman culture. We talked about Christianity. So many of these Germanic tribes were already converting to Christianity, of which when they would go back to their own groups that were not particularly fond of Christianity, they would kill them because they didn't want the tribe to convert to Christianity. And so in 451, so it's the Great Catalonian Plains, sees the Roman and Visigothic forces halt the advance of Attila the Hun into Gaul. This battle is one of the largest military conflicts of the ancient world and marks the high point of the Hunnic expansion into Europe. In 455, so just 4 years after this victory for Rome, Rome is sacked by the Vandals of Northern Africa, the Germanic tribe of Northern Africa that moves into Northern Africa through Spain. And unlike the earlier sack by the Goths, this event is more devastating and marks a significant plundering of the city's wealth. All the gold, all the religious ornaments, everything that they could take out of Rome, they took. And so Rome is basically left vacant. And in 476 then, so we're looking at 21 years later, it's the official fall of the Western Roman Empire. Romulus Augustulus, the last Roman emperor, is deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. This date is traditionally marked as the end. And then we have in the 6th century, although we're not going to be focusing too much on that today, we have the migration of the Anglo-Saxons into Britain. And this intensifies in the 5th and 6th century. So the 400 and the 500s, leading to the establishment of several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in what is today England. And eventually, again, after Alfred the Great, and the fight of the Wessex and the various Anglo-Saxon states against the Vikings, they win and create the first basically English kingdom, the first united England. And so then the Lombards during the 6th century, so this is the 500s, they move and invade Italy in 568 under King Albion and establish a kingdom that would last until the 8th century. This migration marks the last major Germanic movement into the Roman Empire and signifies the end of the migration period. So just to wrap all that up, the migration period was a great time of upheaval and transformation. The movements of peoples across and into the Roman Empire contributed to its decline and fall in the West, while simultaneously laying the foundations for the emergence of the modern nations of Europe. And this is what leads into, for those, again, wondering, well, what's the difference between the ancient period and the Middle Ages or the medieval period? A general demarcation is this 476, this fall of Western Rome. And so you could argue that after this period, we've entered in a way the medieval period, although some people would like to claim that that's sort of late antiquity. Some people frame it that way. But you can think that the fall of the Western Roman Empire is really a movement into the Middle Ages, or some people say the Dark Ages, right? And so in regards to then Constantine and Theodosius, we have to be familiar with the foederati, and this is just a term for the Roman Empire adopting these barbarians as future warriors and soldiers. And so this got, again, because of the depleted empire and their lack of soldiers, they needed to create more and more foederati, tribal groups that would pledge allegiance to Rome, usually through social privileges, land, and money of that sort. And then in exchange, these Gothic groups, these Germanic tribes, would have to offer soldiers. And so under the agreements made under Constantine, this is what's so interesting, is the period that we're focusing on today is also the period in which Christianity is spreading around the Roman Empire. It's officially the Roman religion. And so under Constantine the Great, the Roman Empire began to engage more directly with various Germanic tribes, including the Gauls, through a series of treaties and agreements that allowed these groups to settle in Roman territories as foederati, which is a thing that was throughout the Roman Empire. So there's nothing new there. What's new is the amount of people, is that basically because of the situation that Rome was in, they had no choice. These Germanic peoples are going to become allies of the enemy and it's a greater threat, or you create these sort of agreements and treaties where you concede land to them inside your empire, and in exchange they'll fight for you. And so that's what Constantine the Great did. And in exchange for land and subsidies, these tribes agreed to provide soldiers for the Roman army. This agreement was part of Constantine's broader strategy to bolster the Roman military with barbarian recruits, given the empire's difficulty in raising sufficient numbers of Roman soldiers. While these policies under Constantine laid the groundwork for incorporating Germanic warriors into the Roman military, they did not immediately destabilize the empire. Instead, they reflect Constantine's pragmatic approach to dealing with the empire's changing demographic and military realities. However, over time, the over-reliance on barbarian troops would erode traditional Roman military discipline and loyalty, contributing to the empire's vulnerabilities. Now, under Emperor Theodosius I, which is the last Roman Empire or emperor to rule over both the East and the West, and again, as I said, he's a saint in the Orthodox Church and a great defender of our faith, he also had to make concessions. And so the reign of Theodosius I saw a significant turning point in the relationship between Rome and the Goths, particularly following the Battle of Adrianople in 378, where the Goths decisively defeated the Roman army, killing Emperor Valens. In the aftermath of this catastrophe, Theodosius sought to stabilize the situation through diplomacy and further integration of the Goths into the Roman state. Now, eventually, Theodosius will defeat the Goths, and this is where Alaric gets a little bit upset. So he created more agreements for the Goths to become foederati. And so Theodosius formalized the status of the Goths. This is the latter end of the 300s. Okay, so Constantine's the beginning of the 300s, the beginning of this mass migration period. Now we're right in the heart of it with Theodosius. He's offering more treaties and agreements with the Goths. Theodosius formalized the status of the Goths as foederati, allowing them to settle within the empire's borders, especially in the Balkans. And this is where we get the Bulgars and Bulgaria. In exchange for the Goths, were expected to provide military service. This policy aimed to use the Goths as a buffer against other barbarian groups and as a source for troops for the Roman army. And then military integration and autonomy. Theodosius went further than Constantine in integrating the Goths into the Roman military, allowing them to serve under their own leaders rather than being dispersed among Roman units. This decision, while pragmatic, allowed the Goths to maintain a strong ethnic and tribal identity within the empire, creating a state within a state that could and eventually did act independently of Roman interests. So, for all the great things Theodosius did, this concession after time eventually contributed to the collapse. And so here's a few of the contributions to the collapse of these agreements that our saints, St. Constantine the Great and St. Theodosius, unfortunately had to make. Is the over-reliance, as I said, on barbarian troops. The increasing reliance on barbarian troops, such as the Goths, undermined traditional Roman military system, diluted the loyalty of the army, the discipline of the army, and the entire Roman state. This shift weakened the empire's ability to respond to internal and external threats with a unified, disciplined force. Internal division. So the settlement of large groups of Goths and other Germanic tribes within the empire's borders, often with special privileges and autonomy, contributed to the internal fragmentation of the empire. While this division was not only territorial, but also cultural and military, as these groups often had different interests and loyalties than that of the Roman state. And then economic strain. The financial burden of subsidizing the Goths and other federate tribes strained the Roman economy. They need to provide land and payments for these groups, contributed to the fiscal difficulties of the late empire, exacerbating its decline. And the last point I have is political instability, that the presence of powerful Gothic and other barbarian leaders within the empire, sometimes elevated to high military and political positions, introduced elements of instability in Roman politics. These leaders could and did exercise significant influence, at times acting more in their own interest than the interest of the Roman state. So those are a few of the points that I wanted to highlight. As I said, I think we already went through. Oh, here's part of the collapse of the Roman Empire. So if you want to know all the external, I have a list of external pressures and internal strife within the Roman Empire. And this will wrap up our monologue here, our introduction. We're almost an hour in. And so mass migration, external mass migration and invasions, and then pressure from the Huns. We've already discussed that. But some of the internal strife within the Roman Empire that contributed to its collapse, as I said, political instability and corruption. The Western Roman Empire suffered from frequent changes in leadership, with emperors often coming to power through coups or assassinations rather than orderly succession. This political instability weakened the state's coherence and effectiveness. Additionally, corruption within the government undermined the empire's administrative capabilities. Economic decline. Again, so keep all these internal strifes. Think about how they relate to the Western world today. Political instability and corruption. Number two, economic decline. The empire faced severe economic challenges, including heavy taxation, inflation, and reliance on a slave-based economy that stifled innovation. The constant need to fund the military and subsidize barbarian groups strained the treasury, and economic troubles were exacerbated by the depletion of natural resources, diminishing agricultural output, and disruption of trade routes due to invasions and piracy. Now, also remember that the Vandals took over northern Africa, which was a huge source of grain and food for Rome. Number three, military outstretch and reliance on mercenaries was a contribution. As we've already highlighted, the vastness of the Roman Empire required a large military. And as the number of Roman citizens willing to serve declined, I wonder if that's happening in the Western world, that the domestic population is unwilling to serve the military. The empire increasingly relied on Germanic tribes and mercenaries who were less than loyal to Rome. This reliance eroded traditional military discipline and made the empire vulnerable. Number four is social and moral decay within the Roman Empire itself and Roman culture, Roman identity. So, in a way, you can think of the thing that Rome had a lot of different people groups, but Roman identity unified everybody. You think about the American context. I've mentioned this before, and we were just talking about it in our members group. There's nothing that unifies America. Half of America doesn't even like the idea of American identity. And unfortunately, just a crude way to differentiate this, that's kind of what the MAGA movement is. It's not about, reintroducing slavery, as some people want to say. MAGA movement is just about a sort of preservation of Americana, this sort of American ethos that unified people. And we can talk about consumerism and all these different negative dimensions of that American ethos, but both its good and the bad, it's sort of broken down. Now, the elements of consumerism and narcissism and individualism, that's still present, clearly, but we have no collective ethos, no collective banner, no sacred canopy that we all reside underneath. And this was what also was happening with the Western Roman Empire. And so some scholars argue that the Roman Empire faced a moral and societal decay. Are we facing a moral decay right now? Huh. I think so. Marked by a decline in civic virtue, public spirit, so patriotism and traditional Roman values that had underpinned the empire's success. So its success throughout, again, the long span of Roman history. And so this perspective suggests that the population's engagement with the state and its military declined, weakening the empire from within. The number 5 that I have is the division of the empire. So if you're familiar with like the Diocletian measures, in which instead of having one emperor, again, symbolic of the sort of Pax Romana period, if you're familiar with like the golden age of Rome, where Julius Caesar, before this period though, sort of created in ways the beginnings of the Roman emperor, because before Rome was a republic ruled by the Senate, that as the rise of Julius Caesar and eventually his assassination in the Ides of March, Octavian emerges and he'll become essentially Augustus, the first Roman emperor. But Diocletian breaks up the empire. This is where we see like a formal Western, Eastern, and he broke it up in Gaul and Hispania, and they had different leaders for different sections. So the division of the empire, the Roman Empire, into Eastern and Western halves under Diocletian and later formalized under Theodosius, who was the first one to actually be a single ruler of both, the last one to be the single Roman emperor of both Western and Eastern Empire, may have contributed to the collapse by diluting resources and focus. And we can see this as Rome is falling and struggling to deal with the Goths. Unfortunately, the East wasn't a whole lot of help. They had their own problems with the Sasanian Empire of the Persians. They had their own problems with invasions coming into Thrace from north of the Danube. And so while the Eastern Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years, the Western Empire lacked the economic and administrative strength, cohesion, and abilities that the East had, making it more vulnerable to external pressures and internal collapse. Number six, in regards to contributing effects to the collapse of Rome, is disease and plague. The plague of Cyprian, the 3rd century, and later the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, the 500s, though after the traditional date of the fall, significantly reduced the population of the empire. These pandemics weakened the military, reduced economic productivity, and contributed to social and political instability. And that's another thing. You look at history and you look at empires, it's so funny how all of them historically needed more and more peoples. They wanted peoples to procreate. They needed more peoples and made the empire stronger. And yet our leaders want to depopulate, which would actually cause many problems in productivity and food supply and the such. So it makes you think, interesting parallel there. And so number 7, the last point that I have, is environmental and agricultural difficulty. So environmental changes, climatic changes, as I said, it was actually going through a freezing period, most of Europe at that point, I guess the planet. And environmental degradation may have impacted agricultural productivity, leading to food shortages, increased vulnerability to famine, and competition over resources. This environmental stress could have exacerbated the empire's economic difficulties and societal unrest. So that's going to conclude our introduction today, guys. Now we're going to try to dive a little bit deeper into everything I laid out. I know it's a lot of history, it's a lot of names, it's a lot of references, but hopefully you guys are able to follow. So smash that like, guys. I really appreciate you all being here. I know that was a large, verbose monologue covering a lot of history, but I wanted to give you a basis for understanding the period that we're talking about today. So smash that like. Looks like we had a super chat come in over on YouTube. And Smackamo throws in $5, says, thanks for your work. Well, thank you, Smackamo, for the support. I really appreciate that, my man. And I just want to say, anybody who would like to support the stream, please do so by sending in a super chat, either on YouTube or preferably Streamlabs or the Dono chat. Would greatly appreciate that. I'll check the Dono chat real quick. We got $10 that came up from Spartan Up North. Shout out to Spartan Up North. And he says, it's scary how history repeats itself. Great work as always. Well, thank you very much, Spartan Up North. I'm glad that you're finding the stream interesting and useful, because the goal is to talk about the Western Roman Empire, not so much any sort of contemporary event that may be happening today. But the goal is, if we understand better about the mass migration period and the collapse of Western Rome, maybe we can understand something that would be prescient for our own situation today. Maybe. I'm not going to say that definitively, but maybe. So, guys, smash that like. Logan Daly throws in $10. What up, Logan Daly? Thank you so much, brother, for the support. He says, what if I don't want to support? Wait. Well, I appreciate your support a lot, Logan Daly. You've been very generous to the channel. You've been very supportive of my work, and I am very, very appreciative of that. So thank you very much, brother, for the $10 super chat. And I just want to tell anybody, if you're feeling a little bit generous today, feel free to gift some COTEL Crew memberships here in the live chat. I know we have many people here. I don't see everybody with a member's badge. So make sure you turn on gifting memberships on the channel here. You can do that through that little money sign. And in so doing, you will support our community. You'll support my channel, and it goes a long way. Another super chat just came in. Shout out to Evan, throws in $11.99, 12 euros. Thank you so much, Evan. God bless you, brother. Looks like that was your first time sending in a super chat. Really appreciate you, my man. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. He just throws in, he just says support. Well, thank you very much, Evan. I do appreciate that. And I just want to highlight, so thank you all for, thank you, Smackamo, Logan Daly, Evan, and Spartan Up North for those contributions. Do appreciate it. And before we go any further, got to do a little bit of housekeeping here, and just want to say, if you want to continue to support my work, or you want another option to support, I highly recommend becoming a website member. For $5 a month, you get an access to an exclusive video library, which you can do so through this link right here. And if you really want to be part of the think tank and get into some great private discussions on Zoom, you can become a premium member for $25 a month. We meet twice a month in a private Zoom meeting to talk about the latest happenings around the world. Along with, you'll get access to the fitness meeting, the fitness membership, and the $5 to the exclusive video library. So if that's something you'd be interested in, please check that out. Also, if you'd be interested in signing up for a one-on-one session, we can get in a private group, just you and me, and we can get into any of the specifics, troubles. Just spoke with a gentleman that was struggling with some of the sort of esoteric undermining of Orthodox history and the Bible and scripture. And so recently just had a conversation with a gentleman trying to reassure him that a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense and lay out an Orthodox argument. So if that might be something or anything other, feel free to sign up for a one-on-one session. And also, again, a major shout out goes to Jay Zuna for sponsoring today's stream. Really appreciate you, my man. Jay Zuna. Everybody give a special thank you to Jay Zuna for sponsoring today's stream, choosing today's topic after a little bit of discussion. Thank you very, very much, Jay Zuna. And if you also would like to sponsor a stream on a particular topic, I really like these historical topics, guys. So if you have a topic of history, a group of people, a specific event, I am quite a fan of sponsoring those types of topics because it allows me to dive deeper as opposed to just doing book reviews. Book reviews are good, and I'll do those again. I'll continue those in the future. Right now, I'm doing no more book reviews. I got other reading and things I need to focus on. But if you have a historical topic, I would love for you to sponsor a stream, and you can do so right there with that link. And also, if you'd like to stop by the shop, we got merchandise. You can check that out there. And also, it is present on my YouTube channel. You just click on store, and we got products over there as well. And then last point is if you are in the market for some Orthodox stuff, go check out orthodoxdepot.com, orthodoxdepot.com. Use promo code COTEL. You'll get 10% off. They got icons, incense, prayer ropes, whatever it may be. And you'll be able to help me out a little bit. You'll help a good Orthodox company here in the Midwest out. And so if you're in the market for some Orthodox stuff, check out orthodoxdepot.com and help me out. And then I saw... Thank you. Shout out to Logan Daly again. God, brother, thank you so much. He just gifted 5 COTEL Crew memberships. Welcome, Backbreaker. Welcome, Andrew INFJ. Welcome, Daniel Flares. Welcome, Amateum. And welcome, G Money, to the COTEL Crew. Guys, enjoy your emojis. And thank you so much, Logan Daly. You are so generous, brother. Thank you for the support. Thank you for helping out the community. And everybody who got a membership, make sure you give a special thank you to Logan Daly and a special thank you to Jay Zuna for today's sponsored stream. Okay, so now, guys, let's move into the next point of today's presentation. And so we're going to be looking at, let me pull it up here. Okay. Okay, so we're going to be looking right here. This is just a quick little map of the Roman Empire. But again, you see the Rhine. Can you see my mouse on here? I think you can see my mouse. So yeah, you see my mouse. So right through here, guys, this is the Rhine River, right? When we're reading about the Rhine, that's what we're talking about. This is, again, indicative of whenever they say they cross the Rhine, they're crossing into this part, which is called Gaul. Right? This is Hispania, Spain down here. And over here is the Danube. So when we think about Eastern Roman Empire, this is the Danube River. We see Visigoths over here. This is the Danube. So when we're talking about the Eastern Roman Empire dealing with crossings of the Danube, that's into Thracia or Thrace. And they would rampage all the way down to Thessaloniki. Sometimes they'd go down to Athens. They were never able to take Constantinople, but they would ravage the countryside. So, but what I want to do is, now that we've kind of laid out a historical overview, a lot of the details, I want to play this video for you. And shout out to Dr. Quantum Media English. Not a very big YouTube channel. I thought this was a fantastic overview of the migration period. And so I wanted to play this video for you guys. I checked out Dr. Quantum's YouTube channel, and he's got some interesting stuff. This was the only video I really checked out. But, you know, he Dead Sea Scrolls wasn't really revealed about the origin of Christianity. So maybe some stuff we may not agree with, but this video I think is really good. And so we're going to watch Dr. Quantum Media English YouTube channel. He has a video, only has 600 some views, over the migration period, giving you visuals and understanding to everything I just laid out in that opening monologue. So let's check this out, and then I will get back to you on the other side.
The migration period, also known as the barbarian invasions, was a period in European history marked by large...
Okay, I watch everything at like at least 1.25 to 1.5. I'll put it on normal just so it's easier to understand, so it doesn't feel like it's moving so fast for people.
Scale migrations that saw the fall of the Western Roman Empire and subsequent settlement of its former territories by various tribes, and the establishment of the post-Roman kingdoms. The term refers to the important role played by the migration, invasion, and settlement of various tribes, notably the Franks, Goths, Alemanni, Alans, Huns, early Slavs, Pannonian Avars, Proto-Bulgarians, and Magyars within or into the territories of the Roman Empire and Europe as a whole. The period is traditionally taken to have begun in AD 375 and ended in 568. Various factors contributed to this phenomenon of migration and invasion, and their role and significance are still widely discussed. Historians differ as to the dates for the beginning and ending of the migration period. The beginning of the period is widely regarded as the invasion of Europe by the Huns from Asia in about 375, and the ending with the conquest of Italy by the Lombards in 568, but a more loosely set period is from as early as 300 to as late as 800. For example, in the 4th century, a very large group of Goths was settled as federati within the Roman Balkans, and the Franks were settled south of the Rhine in Roman Gaul. In 406, a particularly large and unexpected crossing of the Rhine was made by a group of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi. As central power broke down in the Western Roman Empire, the military became more important, but was dominated by men of barbarian origin. There are contradictory opinions as to whether the fall of the Western Roman Empire was a result of an increase in migrations, or both the breakdown of central power and the increased importance of non-Romans resulted in internal Roman factors. Migrations and the use of non-Romans in the military were known in the periods before and after, and the Eastern Roman Empire adapted and continued to exist until the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, although it involved the establishment of competing barbarian kingdoms, was to some extent managed by the Eastern emperors. The migrants comprised warbands or tribes of 10,000 to 20,000 people. Immigration was common throughout the time of the Roman Empire, but over the course of 100 years, the migrants numbered not more than 750,000 in total, compared to an average 40 million population of the Roman Empire at that time. The first migrations of peoples were made by Germanic tribes such as the Goths, the Vandals, the Anglo-Saxons, the Lombards, the Suebi, the Frisi, the Jutes, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, the Sciri, and the Franks. They were later pushed westward by the Huns, the Avars, the Slavs, and the Bulgars. Later invasions, such as the Vikings, the Normans, the Varangians, the Hungarians, the Moors, the Romani, the Turks, and the Mongols, also had significant effects. Germanic peoples moved out of southern Scandinavia and northern Germany to the adjacent lands between the Elbe and Oder after 1000 BC. The first wave moved westward and southward, moving into southern Germany up to the Roman provinces of Gaul and Cisalpine Gaul by 100 BC, where they were stopped by Gaius Marius and later by Julius Caesar. It is this western group which was described by the Roman historian Tacitus and Julius Caesar. A later wave of Germanic tribes migrated eastward and southward from Scandinavia between 600 and 300 BC to the opposite coast of the Baltic Sea, moving up the Vistula near the Carpathian Mountains. During Tacitus's era, they included lesser-known tribes such as the Tencteri, Cherushi, Hermunduri, and Chatti. However, a period of federation and intermarriage resulted in the familiar groups known as the Alemanni, Franks, Saxons, Frisians, and Thuringians. The first wave of invasions, between AD 300 and 500, is partly documented by Greek and Latin historians, but is difficult to verify archaeologically. It puts Germanic peoples in control of most areas of what was then the Western Roman Empire. The Tervingi crossed the Danube into Roman territory after a clash with the Huns in 376. Sometime later in Marcianopolis, the escort to their leader Fritigern was killed while meeting with Lupicinus. The Tervingi rebelled, and the Visigoths, a group derived either from the Tervingi or from a fusion of mainly Gothic groups, eventually invaded Italy and sacked Rome in 410 before settling in Gaul. Around 460, they founded the Visigothic kingdom in Iberia. They were followed into Roman territory first by a confederation of Herulian, Rugian, and Syrian warriors under Odoacer that deposed Romulus Augustulus in 476, and later by the Ostrogoths, led by Theodoric the Great, who settled in Italy. In Gaul, the Franks entered Roman lands gradually during the 5th century, and after consolidating power under Childeric and his son Clovis's decisive victory over Syagrius in 486, established themselves as rulers of northern Roman Gaul. Fending off challenges from the Alemanni, Burgundians, and Visigoths, the Frankish kingdom became the nucleus of what would later become France and Germany. The initial Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain occurred during the 5th century, when Roman control of Britain had come to an end. The Burgundians settled in northwestern Italy, Switzerland, and eastern France in the 5th century. Between AD 500 and 700, Slavic tribes settled more areas of Central Europe and pushed farther into southern and eastern Europe, gradually making the eastern half of Europe predominantly Slavic. Additionally, Turkic tribes such as the Avars and later Ugric Magyars became involved in this second wave. In AD 567, the Avars and the Lombards destroyed much of the Gepid kingdom. The Lombards, a Germanic people, settled in Italy with their Herulian, Suabian, Gepid, Thuringian, Bulgar, Sarmatian, and Saxon allies in the 6th century. They were later followed by the Bavarians and the Franks, who conquered and ruled most of Italy. The Bulgars, originally a nomadic group probably from Central Asia, occupied the Pontic steppe north of Caucasus since the 2nd century, but later, pushed by the Khazars, the majority of them migrated west and dominated Byzantine territories along the lower Danube in the 7th century. From that time, the demographic picture of the Balkans changed permanently, becoming predominantly Slavic, while pockets of native people survived in the mountains of the Balkans. During the early Byzantine Arab Wars, Arab armies attempted to invade Southeast Europe via Asia Minor during the late 7th and early 8th centuries, but were defeated at the Siege of Constantinople by the joint forces of Byzantium and the Bulgars. During the Khazar-Arab Wars, the Khazars stopped the Arab expansion into Europe across the Caucasus. At the same time, the Moors invaded Europe via Gibraltar before being halted by the Franks at the Battle of Tours in Gaul. These battles broadly demarcated the frontiers between Christendom and Islam for the next millennium. The following centuries saw the Muslims successful in conquering most of Sicily from the Christians by 902. The Hungarian conquest of the Carpathian Basin from around AD 895, and the following Hungarian invasions of Europe and the Viking expansion from the late 8th century conventionally mark the last large movements of the period. Christian missionaries gradually converted the non-Islamic newcomers and integrated them into the Christendom. Historians have postulated several explanations for the appearance of barbarians on the Roman frontier. Climate change, weather and crops, population pressure, a primeval urge to push into the Mediterranean, the construction of the Great Wall of China causing a domino effect of tribes being forced westward, leading to the Huns falling upon the Goths, who in turn pushed other Germanic tribes before them. In general, French and Italian scholars have tended to view this as a catastrophic event, the destruction of a civilization and the beginning of a dark age that set Europe back a millennium. In contrast, German and English historians have tended to see Roman barbarian interaction as the replacement of a tired, effete, and decadent Mediterranean civilization with a more virile, martial Nordic one. The scholar Guy Halsall has seen the barbarian movement as the result of the fall of the Roman Empire, not its cause. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed that Germanic and Slavic tribes were settled agriculturalists who were probably merely drawn into the politics of an empire already falling apart for quite a few other causes. Goffart argues that the process of settlement was connected to hospitalitas, the Roman practice of quartering soldiers among the civilian population. The Romans, by granting land and the right to levy taxes to allied armies, hoped to reduce the financial burdens of the empire. The crisis of the 3rd century caused significant changes within the Roman Empire in both its western and its eastern portions. In particular, economic fragmentation removed many of the political, cultural, and economic forces that had held the empire together. The rural population in Roman provinces became distanced from the metropolis, and there was little to differentiate them from other peasants across the Roman frontier. In addition, Rome increasingly used foreign mercenaries to defend itself. That barbarization paralleled changes within Barbaricum. To this end, noted linguist Dennis Howard Green wrote, "The first centuries of our era witness not merely a progressive romanization of barbarian society, but also an undeniable barbarization of the Roman world." For example, the Roman Empire played a vital role in building up barbarian groups along its frontier. Propped up with imperial support and gifts, the armies of allied barbarian chieftains served as buffers against other, hostile barbarian groups. The disintegration of Roman economic power weakened groups that had come to depend on Roman gifts for the maintenance of their own power. The arrival of the Huns helped prompt many groups to invade the provinces for economic reasons. The nature of the barbarian takeover of former Roman provinces varied from region to region. For example, in Aquitaine, the provincial administration was largely self-reliant. Halsall has argued that local rulers simply handed over military rule to the Ostrogoths, acquiring the identity of the newcomers. In Gaul, the collapse of imperial rule resulted in anarchy. The Franks and Alemanni were pulled into the ensuing power vacuum, resulting in conflict. In Spain, local aristocrats maintained independent rule for some time, raising their own armies against the Vandals. Meanwhile, the Roman withdrawal from lowland England resulted in conflict between Saxons and the Brittonic chieftains. The Eastern Roman Empire attempted to maintain control of the Balkan provinces, despite a thinly spread imperial army relying mainly on local militias and an extensive effort to refortify the Danubian limes. The ambitious fortification efforts collapsed, worsening the impoverished conditions of the local populace and resulting in colonization by Slavic warriors and their families. Halsall and Noble have argued that such changes stemmed from the breakdown in Roman political control, which exposed the weakness of local Roman rule. Instead of large-scale migrations, there were military takeovers by small groups of warriors and their families, who usually numbered only in the tens of thousands. The process involved active, conscious decision-making by Roman provincial populations. The collapse of centralized control severely weakened the sense of Roman identity in the provinces, which may explain why the provinces then underwent dramatic cultural changes, even though few barbarians settled in them. Ultimately, the Germanic groups in the Western Roman Empire were accommodated without dispossessing or overturning indigenous society, and they maintained a structured and hierarchical form of Roman administration. Ironically, they lost their unique identity as a result of such an accommodation and were absorbed into Latinhood. In contrast, in the East, Slavic tribes maintained a more Spartan and egalitarian existence bound to the land, even in times when they took their part in plundering Roman provinces. Their organizational models were not Roman, and their leaders were not normally dependent on Roman gold for success. Thus, they arguably had a greater effect on their region than the Goths, the Franks, or the Saxons had on theirs. Based on the belief that particular types of artifacts, elements of personal adornment, generally found in a funerary context, are thought to indicate the ethnicity of the person buried, the culture history school of archaeology assumed that archaeological cultures represent the Urheimat of tribal polities, named in historical sources. As a consequence, the shifting extensions of material cultures were interpreted as the expansion of peoples. Influenced by constructionism, process-driven archaeologists rejected the culture historical doctrine and marginalized the discussion of ethnicity altogether, and focused on the intragroup dynamics that generated such material remains. Moreover, they argued that adoption of new cultures could occur through trade or internal political developments rather than only military takeovers.
Okay, so that is our only video for today. Like I said, I thought it was a great a great overview of the whole thing in regards to what some scholars say, different artifacts. This was a thing on the Federati. Again, for those of you who had never heard of that, that's again incorporating the barbarians into the Roman military. And I just had some interesting articles to connect with that. Undocumented immigrants to be allowed to serve in the U.S. military. This is another one. Senate bill renews effort to enlist non-citizens in the U.S. military. Again, I'm not going to dive into details regarding that stuff, trying to keep it TOS appropriate, but you guys can maybe catch a correlation there that it's all good in the hood when the migrants are adopting the local culture. But as the video showed, because the Roman Empire was losing its central power and its influence across its very provinces, those provinces started to take on a sort of new ethos and a new identity that was much more aligned with the migrant communities that lived there, as opposed to the community and the ethos that existed before they got there. So just throwing that in there, just throwing that in there. Now what I wanted to do is kind of introduce you guys to all these different groups: the Goths, the Ostrogoths. This is the Visigothic kingdom. So I was going to just show you guys something quick about the Federate kingdom of the Visigoths. Another group is the Vandals. Just curious how many people are aware of the Vandal kingdom in Northern Africa. I think a lot of people just don't know history. The Franks, obviously, this is going to be the Germanic group that forms what would be considered modern day France. The Anglo-Saxons, of which my ancestors are a part of. So I have Anglo-Saxon ancestry on both of my parents' sides. So I am one of the barbarians. I am one of the migrant invaders. And that's another interesting point to be made for today's conversation, is that mass migration and migration in general is a historical fact, right? We can't get away from it. The question is, why are some empires and some cultures able to take in foreigners and others take them in, but they tend to turn their back on them? And I would argue it all comes back to these main distinctions of identity: language, culture, and religion. Once all these Germanic tribes were unified under Christianity, yeah, they still fought each other, but there was still a sense of harmony, much more so. Now you can look at like the 30 Years' War, the Catholic War against the Protestants, a fissure in the differences between religions. So I think one of the takeaways in a modern takeaway in regards to our conversation today is it's all good in the hood to bring in people from different places that have different language, cultures, and religions. If they adopt the language, culture, and religion of the people they move towards, they tend to assimilate, and there tends to be no real problem. It's when communities maintain their language, their culture, and their religion, they create a distinct identity against and antagonistic towards the host group, and typically that comes to bite them in the end. So there's the Anglo-Saxons, there's the Burgundians, again, the area of Burgundy, the Alemanni, another famous Germanic tribe some people may not be familiar with. That's the Upper Rhine. Then, of course, we have the Huns, another group to discuss regarding mass migration. The Alans, which is an Aaronic nomadic pastoral tribe. And we'll discuss that in a second. The Lombards are more over here. I'll throw that over there. And then some notable historical figures. Obviously, Alaric I. He was the first king of the Visigoths from 395 to 410. He rose to leadership of the Goths, who came to occupy Moesia, territory acquired a couple of decades earlier by a combined force of the Goths and the Alans after the Battle of Adrianople. So that is basically the area of Thrace. Another gentleman is Theodoric the Great. This is the Ostrogoth, eventually the real king that forms the Ostrogoth kingdom, king of the Ostrogoths and ruler of the independent Ostrogoth kingdom of Italy between 493 and 526. Region of the Visigoths, and a patrician of the Eastern Roman Empire, ruler of the combined Gothic realms. Theodoric controlled an empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Adriatic Sea. So that includes the Visigoths, right, in Hispania. Though Theodoric himself was only used the title king, some scholars characterize him as a Western Roman emperor in all but name, since he ruled large parts of the former Western Roman Empire and received the former Western imperial regalia from Constantinople in 497 and was referred to as the title Augustus by some of his subjects. So that's a historical figure to keep in mind. Another one is Gaiseric. He was the king of the Vandals. And man, this guy must have had some kahunas, because he's part of the Gothic group that eventually takes over the Northern Africa. So king of the Vandals and the Alans, he ruled over a kingdom and played a key role in the decline of the Western Roman Empire during the 5th century. The murder of Emperor Valentinian III, who had betrothed his daughter to Gaiseric's son Huneric. And this is really interesting, right? So Gaiseric's son Huneric, the Visigoth king, let me find a map. Do I have a map? I need a good map. Dang it. I need a good map. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Okay, so right through here, you see this purple area? So that's where the Visigoths were. The Vandals move all the way. Here's Adrianople, 378, right? That is the battle that the Rome lost to the Goths. And then eventually Theodosius will win a battle, again, right down here in Thrace as well. So this is Adrianople, 378. Rome loses this battle to the Goths. You can see the Visigoths, their movement all around this area and into Western Spain. Well, the king of the Visigoths at that time, they wanted to create an alliance with the Vandals, and the Vandals sent a messenger. So they sailed out here over into the Atlantic and came into this sort of southern part of France, northern part of Spain, and they made a deal. And the Visigoth king said, "Okay, I'll marry one of my daughters to your son." They did that. Then the Roman Empire, it was Attius. He was a Roman general, very, very powerful at this time. And he had tons of Huns. He has an interesting life. Let me see if I can pull him up. Well, it's like Attius. There we go. This dude right here. So was a Roman general and statesman of the closing period of the Western Roman Empire. He was a military commander and most influential man in the empire for 2 decades. So from 433 to 454. So 455 is the Vandal sack of Rome. He managed policy in regard to attacks of barbarian federates. Well, anyways, about his life, pretty interesting. He was sent as a hostage to the Roman Empire. They would do this to establish negotiations. And he was sent to the Huns, where he learned how to use their military tactics of shooting from horseback, throwing spears, this type of thing. And so he had an interesting life because he was a hostage to both a Gothic tribe and the Huns, and adopted many of their military tactics. And he was very, very powerful at this point. And he was basically ruling Gaul. So I think it was Theodosius II of Rome. So he is the emperor in Constantinople, basically gave him dominion over Gaul, which is what we would consider like France all the way over to the Rhine. And he got word of the fact that the Visigoths had teamed up with the Vandals. And so he then used the sort of Western Roman puppet who was part of the Theodosian line and said, "You should offer your daughter to marry Huneric, Gesseric's son." And Huneric cut off, so the Visigoth wife that he originally had, he cut off her nose and ears and sent her back to the Visigoths and married the Roman woman, because they said he couldn't pass up the opportunity to be married into, Roman royalty and have potentially his own son having an opportunity at the seat of the emperor, right? So I thought that was a crazy story that the Vandal son. So when we're talking about Gaiseric, where's Gaiseric here? Gaiseric's son, Huneric, Here's Heneric. Heneric freaking cut the face off. Essentially, he cut her nose to the bone, and he cut her ears off, and he sent her back to the Visigoths. It's like, bro, just divorce her. What the hell? And and according to some historians, the legend is that the impetus for him to do that, he said she was trying to poison him. Many scholars debate if that was actually the case, and he just needed a way to get out of his marriage with the Visigoth princess, if you will, and marry some type of a Roman bride that would give him more prestige. And so that's what he did. Anyways, I know that's a total tangential story there, not related to our topic, but I mean, kind of related. Interesting tidbit there. But that's who Gesseric is. And so if you're not familiar with him, he the murder of so Valentinian III, who had betrothed his daughter to Gesseric's son Huneric, that's that second wife, led to the Vandal king to eventually invade Italy. So imagine that. You marry your daughter off to the Vandal king's son, and a few years later, they go ahead and sack your capital. Gaiseric repulsed two major attempts by both halves of the Roman Empire to reclaim North Africa, inflicting devastating defeats on the forces of Majorian in 460 and Basiliscus in 468. As a result, the Romans abandoned their campaign against the Vandals and concluded peace with Gaiseric. Gaiseric died in Carthage in 477, was succeeded by his son Huneric. Though his nearly 50 years of rule, Gaiseric raised a relatively inconsequential Germanic tribe to the status of a major Mediterranean power. So interesting historical figure regarding this period if you're not familiar. And of course, the Vandal kingdom is destroyed during the Reconquista of St. Justinian. So as Justinian then reconquers the Roman Empire, I saw people were mentoring General Belisarius. If you're not familiar, I would highly recommend checking those videos out. They have great videos. Again, some of the two channels that I highly recommend regarding checking out topics on these things is the Kings and Generals and History Make. If you've ever seen this YouTube channel, he does great work as well. If you put in history, and it's all one word, Marche. This is a great YouTube channel. It doesn't even have a million subscribers yet. It should, but it has great stuff. So if you haven't checked them out, check them out in Kings and Generals. Those are two channels I highly recommend if you want to kind of a better grasp on history and some of the stuff that's happening here. So eventually, Geiseric's kingdom, the Vandal kingdom, St. Justinian defeats them. And he also defeats parts of the Ostrogoth. He takes over Rome. Again, people that are familiar with Belisarius, they eventually take over Rome, but they don't take over the entire Italian peninsula. So the Ostrogoths still ruled for a large period of that time. Anyways, so I just wanted to lay that out there. And then if you're not familiar with Theodosius I, this is another great Roman Christian emperor. If you're Orthodox and you're not familiar with Theodosius I, you should familiarize yourself a bit. He was a Roman emperor from 379 to 395, so right at the height of this mass migration period. During his reign, he succeeded in a crucial war against the Goths, as well in two civil wars, and was instrumental in establishing the Creed of Nicaea as the Orthodox doctrine of Christianity. He was not a fan of the Arians. Let's just put it that way. So in Arianism, when Christianity, many of the pagans were willing to convert to Arian Christianity. And he saw this as a huge problem because he believed he was a devoted Christian and he believed in the Nicene Creed. Again, so St. Constantine establishes the Council of Nicaea in 325. And there was theological conflict with Christology. Theodosius was not interested in that at all. And so he was very emphatic in the promotion of the Nicene Creed, and he established the Edict of Thessaloniki. That was probably somewhere in here. We'll look at that. So Theodosius was the last emperor to rule the entire Roman Empire before its administration was permanently split between the West and the East. So Born in Hispania. In regards to, so here's the war against the Goths. Throughout the second half of 379, Theodosius and his generals based out of Thessaloniki, won some minor victories over individual bands of raiders, but suffered at least one serious defeat in 380, which was blamed on the treachery of a new barbarian recruits. So again, there we see the infusion of all the federati, right? All these migrants joining the military, and when it's convenient for them to fight for Rome, they will. But when it's a little inconvenient for them, they tend to backstab. Some obscure victories were recorded, official sources around that time, however, and in Theodosius recovered, prompted him to request. During the autumn of 380, a life-threatening illness from which Theodosius recovered prompted him to request baptism. Some obscure victories were recorded in official sources around this time. However, in November of 380, the military situation was found to be sufficiently stable for Theodosius to move his court to Constantinople. There, the emperor enjoyed a propaganda victory when in 381 he received the first visit and submission of a minor Gothic leader, Athanaric. By this point, however, Theodosius seems to have no longer believed that the Goths could be completely ejected from the Roman territory, which they couldn't. They occupied way too much territory. After Athanaric died that very same month, the emperor gave him a funeral with full honors, impressing his entourage and signaling to the enemy that the empire was disposed to negotiate terms. During the campaigning season of 381, reinforcements from Gratian drove the Goths out of Macedonia and Thessaly into Thrace, while in the latter sector, Theodosius, one of his generals, repulsed the incursion by a group of Syrian Huns across the Danube. Okay, so that was him defeating the Goths. Then here we have the Civil War, and it's the second Civil War that's so interesting, this one here, because it was really about Roman identity. That this Civil War in Rome broke out, and this is really, as I said earlier, the real stamping of the Roman Empire as Christian is when Theodosius defeated Arbogast. So if we go, so here's Arbogast. Let's see about, here we go. Arbogast and Eugenius. So the Battle of Frigidus, and Kings and Generals has a great video on this. If you want to learn about the Battle of Frigidus, in which Theodosius defeats the pagan revival within Rome. So let's see if this describes the pagan. Yeah, so this was the decisive battle. We don't need to read all this, but basically to get you to the point is that this Battle of Frigidus was between the Western and Eastern Empire within Rome, both sides competing against who's going to essentially rule the empire moving forward. And glory to God, Theodosius in Orthodoxy defeated paganism, and that was the official stamp of Christianity on the empire. And then I had something on the Holy Roman Empire, all that different stuff. So it looks like we had a few super chats come in. So anything in particular you guys want to dive into, let me know. Melly throws in $5 over on the YouTube, and she says, I'm late to the party, David. What's going on with the Germans? Well, the Germans are at it again, except this was in the 4th and 5th century. So you didn't miss too much. You can always go back and check out the opening. I had like an hour-long monologue trying to lay out the timeline and historical importance of this mass migration period. But thank you, Melly, for the $5 super chat. Really do appreciate the support. And then over on the Dono chat, we got a generous super chat comes in from Pim Orso. No message. He throws in $35. Thank you so much, Pim, for that. Really appreciate you, brother. And we got $5 came in from Blue Skittle. No comment as well. Thank you very much, Blue Skittle and Pim. Really appreciate that generous super chat, Pim. And so let me check the Streamlabs. Looks like nothing is up over on Streamlabs. So again, if you guys want to support this stream, this actually took a lot of research to bring all this information, especially the monologue. Took me a while to gather all the information to put this stream together. But If you would like to support my work and you would support this stream, first, let's give a shout out to Jay Zuna for sponsoring today's stream. Shout out to Jay Zuna for sponsoring the stream. But if you want to support my work, you want to support streams like this, feel free to send in a super chat using Streamlabs, Dono Chat, or YouTube, whichever one you prefer to use. Oh, Logan Daly. Gosh dang, Logan. Thank you so much for all the support. He says the Gales were on screen a couple of times. Yeah. And shout out to the Celts, because they were one of the last groups to really hold out. Although, even though they dominated most of Europe, especially before this invasion period, and really before Rome conquered Gaul and all that area, I mean, it was all Celtic. They were the last holdout. Ireland was the last holdout. And I mentioned this when I did a stream with Baron Strawberry, is I wonder, one of the reasons why Ireland is protesting, like in Dublin, against, again, mass migration. One of the reasons they might be the ones protesting mass migration is because they still have a sense of unified identity. They're still the Irish people. You know, Gaelic is still spoken in Ireland. And that identity, again, it all comes back down to identity. What is your identity? And are you able to preserve that? I would argue in America, we don't really have an identity anymore. I don't even know what it means to be American. Now, if you ask me, I'd probably describe some type of Midwestern, Southern sensibilities and ethos as that's really what America is. But, you know, the vast majority of the country doesn't share that ethos anymore. So what does it actually mean to be American, and what identity is that? I'd say we don't really have an identity. And that makes us as a group of people highly, highly susceptible to mass migration and a collapsing of our way of life. So it is what it is. Anyways, so thank you, Logan Daly, for all that. Really appreciate it. Now, again, the last part, because today's focus was on the migration, I really want to talk a little bit about who these different groups were, because many of us have heard of them. Not all of us have learned a little bit about who they are. And so obviously the most important group during this mass migration period is the Goths. And so they were a Germanic people who played a major role in the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the emergence of medieval Europe. In his book, Getica, historian Jordanus writes that the Goths originated in southern Scandinavia. That's according to most consensus, and they come down into, you could say Europe, but more Eastern Europe. But the accuracy of this count is unclear. It's debated. Most people agree that they come from Scandinavia. I'll put it that way. A people called the Guttonis, possibly early Goths, are documented living near the lower Vistula River in current Poland in the 1st century, where they are associated with the archaeological wheelbark culture. And in the 2nd century, the wheelbark culture expanded southwards towards the Black Sea, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Moldavia, Romania, that whole area. It has been seen associated with Gothic migration, and by the late 3rd century, it contributed to the formation of the Chernyakov culture. By the 4th century, at the latest, several Gothic groups were distinguishable, among them the Theravingi and the Gurthungi were the most powerful. During this time, Wulfila began a conversion of Goths to Christianity. In the late 4th century, the lands of the Goths were invaded from east by the Huns. In the aftermath of this event, several groups of Goths came under Hunnic domination, while others migrated further west and sought refuge inside the Roman Empire. Goths who entered the Roman Empire by crossing the Danube inflicted a devastating defeat on the Romans at the Battle of Adrianople, 378. These Goths would form the Visigoths, and under their king Alaric I, they began a long migration, eventually establishing the Visigothic kingdom in Spain at Toledo. Meanwhile, Goths under the Hunnic rule gained their independence in the 5th century, most importantly, the Ostrogoths under their king Theodoric the Great. And so a little bit on their origin and history we can see there, and eventually, again, making their way into all parts of Europe. The other group is obviously the Ostrogoths, and they're part of the Gothic kingdom. So we don't need to go too deep into it, but who were the Ostrogoths. Again, contributing to the decline of the Eastern Roman Empire, there was a Gothic population that settled in the Balkans in the 4th century, having crossed the lower Danube, while the Visigoths had formed under the leadership of Alaric. The new Ostrogoth political entity, which came to rule Italy, was formed in the Balkans under the influence of the Amel dynasty, the family of Theodoric the Great. After the death of Attila, remember, this is the Catalonian Plains, the battle at the Catalonian Plains. This is the last great victory of the Roman Empire against its enemy. And they don't kill Attila. Attila apparently they retreat back into their land, and Attila gets married to a young woman. And upon the sort of marriage festivities, apparently, drinking, I assume maybe some sexual intercourse, he apparently died in the night, and it's speculated. Some scholars believe maybe he was assassinated. Maybe people lost support for him because he lost the battle. I mean, he had this great reputation, Attila the Hun, of being, he can't be defeated. And then once he lost the battle at the Catalonian Plains, some scholars speculate maybe he lost the support of his people. Nobody really knows. But anyways, he ended up dying after he got married to the young girl. And in just a matter of years, the Huns decentralized empire that controlled all the way from what would be considered modern day Russia into Western Europe dissipated. It just basically disappeared. So anyways, the collapse of the Hunnic Empire represented by the Battle of Nedo in 453, the Amel family began to form their kingdom in Pannonia. Byzantine Emperor Zeno played these Pannonian Goths off against the Thracian Goths, but instead the two groups united after the death of the Thracian leader Theodoric Strabo and his son Ricatok. Zeno then backed Theodoric to invade Italy and replace Odoacer, who was the first king of Italy after 476. So Odoacer is the one who comes into power there. When he defeated Odoacer's force and killed his rival at a banquet, that's when Theodoric the Great becomes essentially, and that's why some speculate why the Eastern Roman Empire gave him Roman regalia, because Zeno did support his invasion in Italy and the overthrowing of Odoacer. Following the death of Theodoric, there was a period of instability, eventually tempting the Byzantine Emperor Justinian to declare war on the Ostrogoths in 535 in an effort to restore the former western provinces of the Roman Empire. Initially, the Byzantines were successful, but under the leadership of Totila, the Goths reconquered most of the lost territory until Totila's death at the Battle of Tagine. The war lasted almost 21 years and caused enormous damage across Italy, reducing the population of the peninsula. Any remaining Ostrogoths in Italy were absorbed into the Lombards and established the kingdom in Italy. So that's a little bit of the Ostrogoths. And if we find our map here again, this is a great map, right? So if you want to see, this is the map. So we can see the kingdom of the Visigoths over here, the kingdom of the Suebi, which are eventually mostly annihilated, the Vandal kingdom in northern Africa here. See the Odoacer, the kingdom of Odoacer. This is 476. So this is a map of the Roman Empire when it fell. So you can get a good idea. The Anglo-Saxons, look at northern Germany, look at the Danes. Denmark up here, you can see the Anglo-Saxons already invading Britain and already forming their Anglo-Saxon states. You can see the Britain little province out where in modern day France. You can see the Franks already taking up territory, the Alemanni, which is another Germanic tribe. You can see the kingdom of the Rug, again, modern lower Germany, kingdom of the Ostrogoths, kingdom of the Gepids. The Gepids always aligned with the Huns, so typically a historical enemy there. Thuringians up through here. So this gives you a good idea of what it looked like and how it sort of broke up. And so you can already begin to see some of the modern states. The Burgundians influence into Switzerland. You can see the Franks. They're going to dominate modern day France. Visigothic influence into modern day Spain. yeah. So eventually, again, the Ostrogoths eventually get brought into the Lombards. So okay, moving forward here, you guys are picking up what I'm putting down. Visigothic kingdom, we talked a little bit about that. So the Visigoths are the ones that move into modern day Spain. So you can see right here, right there. And the Visigothic kingdom, now southwestern France and the Iberian Peninsula from the 5th to 8th century, one of the Germanic successor states of the Western Roman Empire, was originally created by the settlement of the Visigoths under King Walia. Southwest Gaul, Visigoths were Romanized Central Europeans who had moved west of the Danube Valley, and they became federati, as we talked about, of Rome, and wanted to restore the Roman order against the hordes of the Vandals, the Alans, and the Suebi. So the Visigoths had a historic, compared to all the Gothic kingdoms, they definitely had the best relationship with Rome. The Franks, they began as a Germanic people who lived near the lower Rhine. During the northern continental frontier of the empire, they subsequently expanded their power and influence during the Middle Ages until much of the population of Western Europe, particularly in and near France, were commonly described as Franks. For example, in the context of their joint efforts during the Crusades starting in the 11th century, this expansion came about because of the Romanized, Latinized Frankish dynasties based within the collapsing Western Roman Empire. First became the rulers of the whole region between the rivers of Loire and the Rhine, and then subsequently imposed power over many of the post-Roman kingdoms, both inside and outside the old empire. So although the Frankish name does not appear until the 3rd century, at least some of the original Frankish tribes had long been known to the Romans under their own names, both as allies providing soldiers as well as enemies. The Franks were first reported as working together to raid Roman territory. However, the Romans also reported the Franks suffering attacks upon them from outside their frontier area and being allowed to move into Roman territory. Again, something that we highlighted eventually led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Frankish people subsequently lived inside Rome's frontier on the Rhine River and often divided by historians into two groups: the Salian Franks of the West, who came south via the Rhine Delta, and the Riparian of Rhineland Franks, or Rhineland Franks of the East, who eventually conquered the Roman frontier city of Cologne and took control of the left bank of the lower Rhine in that region. So the others, the Anglo-Saxons, you guys are going to, especially many of you guys probably have some English ancestry, as I do. Yes, Milan is in Lombardy, yes. And grandmother was yeah. So the Lombards take over basically northern Italy, FYI, for those who aren't familiar. We'll get to the Lombards in the next one. The Anglo-Saxon trace their origins to Germanic settlers that came to Britain from the mainland. So the Anglo-Saxons had small little territories in the Roman Empire, and they were another federati. So they would join the Roman ranks for money, for land, for various social opportunities. But they were really located up north, and so their migration periods not so much moving into the Roman territories as the Franks or the Visigoths, but after the fall of Rome, they basically take over Britain. And so the settlers came to Britain from mainland Europe in the 5th century. Although the details are not clear, their cultural identity developed out of the interactions of these settlers with pre-existing Romano-British culture. Over time, most of the people of what is now southern, central, northern, and eastern England came to identify as Anglo-Saxon and speak Old English. My ancestors were Anglo-Saxon. Danish and Norman invasions later changed the situation significantly, but their language and political structures are the direct predecessors of the medieval Kingdom of England and the Middle English language. Although the modern English language owes somewhat less than 26% of its words to Old English, this includes the vast majority of words used in everyday speech. The history of the Anglo-Saxons is the history of a cultural identity. It developed from divergent groups in association with the people's adoption of Christianity and was integral to the founding of various kingdoms. Threatened by extended Danish Viking invasions, of which, again, that's how the Kingdom of England is established, beginning with Alfred the Great. Anglo-Saxon material culture can still be seen in architecture, dress styles, illuminated texts, metalwork, and other art. Behind the symbolic nature of these cultural emblems, there are strong elements of tribal and lordship ties. The elite declared themselves kings who developed burhs, fortifications, and fortified settlements, and identified their roles and peoples in biblical terms. Above all, as archaeologist Helena Hamerow has observed, local and extended kin groups remained the essential unit of production throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. The effects persist, as a 2015 study found the genetic makeup of British populations today show divisions of tribal political units on the early Anglo-Saxon period. Now do a genetic makeup of Britain. I bet there's a lot less Anglo-Saxon and Norman identity, or even British, the ancient Britons. Imagine it's certainly less than it used to be. Next group are the Lombards, and they take over essentially the northern section of Italy. So you probably have heard of the Lombards. They were also a Germanic people who conquered the Italian peninsula between 568 and 774. They go all the way down to here. Eventually they'll recede back up to here. The medieval Lombard historian Paul the Deacon wrote in the History of the Lombards between 787 and 796 that the Lombards descended from a small tribe called the Wenili, who dwelt in northern Germany. Before migrating to seek new lands, earlier Roman-era historians wrote of the Lombards in the 1st century AD as being one of the Swabian peoples. Again, remember, the Swabian peoples, they're on really what would be considered modern-day Portugal, northern Spain. So they get on the west side of the Iberian Peninsula there. Also, from what is now northern Germany near the Elbe River, they migrated south, and by the end of the 5th century, the Lombards had moved into the area roughly coinciding with modern Austria and Slovakia north of the Danube. Here they subdued the Hurls and later fought frequent wars with the Gepids. The Lombard king Audin defeated the Gepid leader, and his successor Albion eventually destroyed the Gepids in 567. The Lombards also settled in Pannonia, modern-day Hungary, and archaeologists have unearthed burial sites of Lombard men and women buried together as families, unusual among Germanic peoples at that time. Contemporary traces have also been discovered of Mediterranean Greeks and a possible migrant from France. So let's see if there's the Lombards taking over Italy. Here's the migration. So moving from northern Germany southward into various regions, invasion into the Italian peninsula. So that's 568, 774. Again, we talked a little bit about that. At least 20,000 Saxon warriors, old allies of the Lombards and their families, joined them in their new migration. The first important city to fall was Forum Lully in northeastern Italy in 569. There, Albion created the first Lombard duchy, where he entrusted his nephew Gisulf. Soon, Vicenza, Verona, and Brescia fell into Germanic hands. In the summer of 569, the Lombards conquered the main Roman center of northern Italy, Milan. The area then recovering from a terrible Gothic wars, and the small Byzantine army left for its defense could do almost nothing. Longinus, the exarch sent to Italy by Emperor Justin II, could only defend coastal cities and could be supplied by the powerful Byzantine fleet. Pavia fell after a siege of 3 years. So again, after that, they moved further into Tuscany and establishing 2 duchies. So when they entered Italy, some Lombards retained their native form of paganism, while some were Arian Christians. As I mentioned, this is a common feature when we looked at these migrations. That's why for Theodosius I, Emperor Theodosius, Saint Theodosius, the Orthodox faith was essential, because he saw that Arian Christianity many of these pagan groups, yeah, they would adopt that, but they wouldn't adopt the full faith. They would not adopt the Nicene Creed. And this is just another indication of that, right? So they would remain, some took on their paganism while others took on Arian Christianity. Hence, they did not enjoy good relations with the early Christian church. I wonder why. Gradually, they adopted Roman and Romanized titles, names, and traditions, and partially converted to Orthodoxy in the 7th century, though not without a long series of religious and ethnic conflicts. By the time Paul the deacon was writing, the Lombard language, dress, and even hairstyles had nearly all disappeared in total. So there you go. And then this is the lower duchy that they eventually had. Come on. There we go. So you can see this is southern Italian peninsula here. So just highlighting some of that. Now, the Burgundians were an early Germanic tribe and group of tribes that appeared in the Middle Rhine region near the Roman Empire and were later moved into the empire in Eastern Gaul. They were possibly mentioned much earlier in the time of the Roman Empire as living in part of the region of Germania that is now part of Poland. The Burgundians are first mentioned together with the Alemanni as early as the 11th panegyric to the Emperor Maximian, given in Tyre in 291 AD, referring to events that must have happened between 248 and 291, and they apparently remained neighbors for centuries. By 411, a Burgundian group had established themselves on the Rhine between the Franks and the Alemanni, holding the cities of Worms, Speyer, and Strasbourg. In 436 AD, Atitus, again, this was this guy right here, the Roman Magisterium Militum, who had incredible power at that point. He defeated the Burgundians on the Rhine with the help of the Hunnish forces. Remember, his power came from being a hostage with the Huns, adopting many Hunnic practices and that type of thing, and then used Huns within his military force. And then in 443, he resettled the Burgundians within the Empire of Eastern Gaul. And so if we go back to our original map here, the Burgundians are going to be right here. So like southeastern France, northwestern Italy. That's where the Burgundians are going to be. Then we have the Alemanni, another Germanic tribe, was a confederation of Germanic tribes on the upper Rhine River during the first millennium, first mentioned by Cassius Dio in the context of the campaign of the Roman Emperor Caracalla in 213. The Alemanni were conquered by the Frankish leader Clovis and incorporated into his dominions, mentioned as still pagan allies of the Christian Franks. The Alemanni were gradually Christianized during the 7th century. During the 8th century, the Frankish suzerainty over Alemannia was mostly nominal after a usurping. Okay. So later, during the weaker years of the Carolingian Empire, the Alemannic courts became almost independent, and a struggle for supremacy took place between them and the bishopric of Constance. The chief family of the Alemanni was the Counts of Raetia, who were sometimes called Margraves. Okay. And then we have the Huns. Not a whole lot is known of the Huns. They're kind of a lost group to history. And so they lived in Central Asia, the Caucasus, Eastern Europe between the 4th and 6th century, according to European tradition. They were first reported living on the Volga River in an area that was part of the Scythia at the time. So we do believe that they're Scythians. And the Huns' arrival in Europe is associated with the migration westward of an Iranian people, the Alans. By 370 AD, the Huns had arrived on the Volga, and by 430, they had established a vast, if short-lived, dominion in Europe, conquering the Goths and many other Germanic peoples living outside Roman borders and causing many of these to flee into Roman territory. Remember, the mass migration was catalyzed by the invasion of the Huns from the east. The Huns, especially under King Attila, made frequent and devastating raids in the Eastern Roman Empire. In 451, they invaded the Western Roman province of Gaul, where they fought a combined army of Romans, Visigoths at the Battle of Catalonian Fields in 452. They invaded Italy. After the death of Attila in 453, the Huns ceased to be a major threat to Rome and lost much of their empire following the Battle of Nedao. Descendants of the Huns or successors with familiar names were recorded by neighboring populations of the south, east, and west, having occupied parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia from about the 4th to the 6th centuries. Variants of the Hun name are recorded in the Caucasus until early 8th century. So Attila the Huns, always remember them. And then this is an interesting group, the Alans. This is this Iranic tribal people or Persian tribal people. Were an ancient and medieval Iranic nomadic pastoral people of the North Caucasus, generally regarded as Samaritans and possibly related to the Mazagati. Modern historians have connected the Alans with Central Asian Yankai or Chinese sources, and with the Aorsi of Roman sources, having migrated westward and become dominant among the Samaritans of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. The Alans were mentioned by Roman sources in the 1st century AD. At the time, they had settled the region north of the Black Sea and frequently raided the Parthian Empire and the Caucasian provinces of the Roman Empire. From 215 to 250, the Goths broke with their power on the Pontic steppe. Upon the Hunnic defeat of the Goths on the Pontic steppe around 375 AD, many of the Alans migrated westward along with various Germanic tribes. They crossed the Rhine in 406 AD, along with the Vandals and the Suebi, settling in Orleans and Valence. Around 409 AD, they joined the Vandals and the Suebi and crossing the Pyrenees into the Iberian Peninsula, settling in Lusitania and Hispania Carthaginosis. The Iberian Alans soundly defeated the Visigoths in 418 AD, subsequently surrendered their autonomy to the Hasdingi Vandals, and that is Gesseric. There are the Hasdingi Vandals, not the Suebi. In 428 AD, the Vandals and the Alans crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa. They founded their kingdom, which lasted until its conquest by forces of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian the First, 534. So that kind of does it on many of the places. This is a map of the Danube that I wanted to highlight. So we see the Rhine right here, and then we see the Danube cut across through here. Major rivers, if you're going to look into Roman history, the Rhine and the Danube. But anyways, guys, what are your general takes? Let me see if anybody have anything to say. It looks like Logan Daly threw in another super chat. Shout out to Logan Daly, throws in another $5. Said Midwest also mentioned. That's right, fellow Midwesterner here. Logan Daly, thank you so much, brother, for all your support, man. I really do appreciate that. And so thank you, brother, for that. Let me just check the dono chat real quick as well. All right. And doesn't look like anything is on the Streamlabs. Logan Daly said Anatolian Greeks were largely bred or wiped out by the Ottoman Empire. That's true. They still exist. You know, St. Paisios was an Anatolian Greek. So they still exist. But their culture has certainly been persecuted by the Ottomans and modern day Turkey. Dr. Crispy said the Christians in Turkey and the Levant identify as Romans. They do. And then Melly says Germans immigrated to America and didn't create chaos. No, because they already had the Christian ethos. They could maintain their German identity, but they learned English and they were Christian. Again, remember the 3 or 4 components that really cause difficulty for these migrant groups to assimilate: differences in religion, differences in language, differences in culture, differences in law. And so when we look at, the Ellis Island period of the United States, well, a lot of different people groups coming to the United States, but they were learning English. They were Christian. We had similar religions, either Protestant or Catholic mostly. And they were willing to adopt the culture. And so cultural assimilation happened. You look at the Roman Empire, these are things that were not as smooth as others. Pim says, according to the legend of Tizia River had been diverted and his grave was dug in the riverbed, some of the guards killed all those present so that they could not tell where Attila's grave was. Yeah, there's still a lot of speculation about how did Attila the Hun die. As I said, he gets married to a young girl, has a festal celebration, and apparently passed away. Was he assassinated? Did he die of natural causes? Was he in bad health? We don't really have that type of records because the Huns weren't exactly writing history at that period. So that is certainly one theory for sure. Kid says prohibition was largely an attack on German immigrants. Yeah. Well, Logan Daly says DPH early was the word Swabic or Swabian from Lombard origins. Swabic are the Swabians, and let me see if I thought I had a section on the Swabians. They were another Germanic group. Let me put in Swabians. Swabi. So the Swabians, like I said, large Germanic group originally from the Elbe River in what is now Germany or the Czech Republic. In the early Roman era, they included many peoples of other names, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, Hermunduri, the Simeons, and Lombards. So Lombards are part of that larger group. New groupings later formed, such as the Alemanni and Bavarians. Two kingdoms in the migration period were simply referred to as Swabian. The Swabians were first mentioned by Julius Caesar in connection to the invasion of Gaul. So they were already there before the turn of the millennium, or before Christ was born, before the year zero. Julius Caesar had already made note of them. Unlike Tacitus, he described them as a single people distinct from the Marcomanni, with a larger Germanic category who he saw as a growing threat to Gaul and Italy in the 1st century BC, as they had been moving southwards aggressively at the expense of Gallic tribes and establishing Germanic presence in the immediate areas north of the Danube. In particular, he saw the Swabians as the most warlike of the Germanic peoples. During the reign of Augustus, so we're talking about Octavian, Rome made aggressive campaigns into Germania east of the Rhine and north of the Danube, pushing towards the Elbe after suffering a major defeat to the Romans in 9 BC. Macrobidus became king of the Swabian kingdom and was established within the protective mountains and forest of Bohemia. The Swabians did not join the alliance led by Arminius. So there you go. Again, it's a lot of people. There's a lot of timelines. It's difficult to present some of this information sometimes because where do you start, right? Today's conversation, we began a little bit about what are some takeaways in regards to mass immigration and the fall of the Roman Empire, external, internal conflicts. There's a large timeline. I created a whole timeline of the most important events in Roman history. I guess I can go over it real quick. The stream's pretty much over, but I highlighted what are the most important events in the founding of the Republic, right? Rome was a republic. Roman history is really divided in two periods, the period of the Republic and then the period of the Empire with the Roman Emperor. And so the Republic, I have 753 BC, traditional date for the founding of Rome, 509 BC, the overthrow of the Roman monarchy and the establishment of the Roman Republic, 495 BC, the first Secessio Plebis, leading the creation of the office of the tribune of the plebs. 451, 450, decemviri, appointed to write down laws, leading to the creation of the 12 tables. Anyways, moving forward, you have the first Samnite War in 343, 341 BC. Second Samnite War, 326. The First Punic War. Well, you had the Third Samnite War, 298. Then you had the First Punic War against Carthage, and this is Rome's acquisition of Sicily. That is 264. 218, 201 is the Second Punic War. That's where Hannibal, again, the great military general of Carthage, invades Italy and stays in Italy for multiple years. It's a rather amazing campaign by Hannibal, eventually defeated. In 149, you have the Third Punic War against Carthage. And 133, you have Tiberius is elected at the tribune of the plebs, initiating a period of social and political reform efforts. Of course, you have Julius Caesar. The first triumvirate formed between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus is 60 BC. You have Caesar's civil war in 49 to 45 BC. You have the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Then you have the Battle of Actium by Octavian, defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And then in 27 BC, Octavian is granted the title of Augustus, and we see the beginning of the Roman emperor. And so AD 14, so the year 14, the death of Augustus, ascension of Tiberius, initiating the Julio-Claudian dynasty. We see competitions at the Colosseum during this period. We see the reign of the five good emperors. So if you're not familiar, the five good emperors, that was beginning in 96 to 180. And so then you have the death. It kind of ends with the death of Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic philosopher emperor. And that's kind of the end of the Pax Romana, the Golden Age. And that's in 180 AD. And so things were a little bit difficult for the Roman Empire. We see the Edict of Milan is legalized in 313. So in 312, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, this is where Emperor Constantine the Great defeats another Roman legionary and eventually establishes Christianity as the new religion of Rome. And then in 313, we see the Edict of Milan. Christianity is legalized. The foundation of Constantinople as the new capital in 330. The Battle of Adrianople. The death of Theodosius I in 395. The sack of Rome by the Vandals the first one's by the Visigoths and Alaric in 410. Then the Vandals in 455. And then the last Roman emperor in 476 in the West. So to me, that is a complete timeline of the Roman Empire, if you're going to ask me. But I didn't want to include that. I didn't want to derail the stream too much. Logan Daly throws in another $5. Thank you so much, brother. He says, how much for a complete history of Celtic Gaelic peoples? Well, if you want me to do that, you could sponsor a stream. If you'd like to sponsor a stream, you can do so. I would be open to doing that. Let's see. So if you would like to sponsor that stream, Logan, you can do so with this link right here. I would be certainly open to providing a history of the Celtic Gaelic peoples, beginning with their mass migration into modern day Europe. I mean, they dominated Europe before the Germanic tribes. Unfortunately, there was a constant losing battle after the ascendancy of these Germanic tribes in this mass migration period, but the Celts dominated Europe. And eventually it was a continual recession until they're in the places that they reside today. But if you want to sponsor that stream, I'd definitely be open to it. So anyways, guys, I think that's going to do today's stream. Again, a very special thank you to Jay Zuna for sponsoring today's stream. I hope you enjoyed the stream, Jay Zuna. I know it's a very large topic. It's kind of hard to encapsulate the whole thing. I think if somebody were to watch this stream, they'd have a better understanding of the migration period, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and how all these things correlated together. So thank you very much, Jay Zuna, for all that. Really appreciate your support, guys. And I appreciate all you. Please smash that like. Let me just make sure nobody's sending any questions or super chats before we hop off here. Again, I want to give a special thank you to all the supporters today. Blue Skittle, Pim, thank you, Pim, for your generous super chat. Spartan Up North, and then, of course, over here on YouTube, thank you, Smackamo, Logan Daly, especially Logan Daly, for your generous support today. Thank you very much, brother. Evan from Europe, Melly as well. And I don't see anything over on the Streamlabs. So that looks like that is all of them. So, guys, thank you all for being here. This is another sponsored stream. I hope you guys appreciated it. And I hope it was useful and you got something out of it. So smash that like. I will be back Sunday with another stream. Going to be taking off Friday and Saturday, get some other work done. So I will see you all on Sunday. And as always, until next time, God bless.